Hey everybody, I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy, Aristotle, and Aristotle's social thought, specifically Aristotle's ethics and politics, if they can be considered that. So, I am here in Berserkly Town. As I've already mentioned, Aristotle in his Politics basically says, so, in society has put men over women and masters over slaves and tried to separate the rational from the irrational and hoisted people upon people. And right where the feminist student would say, yeah, more power, fight the power, Aristotle would say, what are you talking about, and would be more like Confucius, kind of Republican traditional dad, and be like, well, that's the moral fiber of the community. What are you talking about? Of course, I have somewhat different beliefs, but again, I am not talking about teaching you my beliefs. We are going to get into Aristotle's ethics and politics, and again, it is a bit old school and old world, so we will get into all of that. And again, teach the controversy, whatever that was originally hooked up to. So, human thought and a bunch of disagreement. Yes, Aristotle is called the father of logic and debate. He was not exactly that. Again, he would have found that debatable with the Babylonians, Egyptians, and others. However, we're going to get to Aristotle's logic after this. As mentioned, we're going to do Aristotle's Politics and Ethics this lecture. So, I got a cat in the background. So Aristotle believed a beast, all too rational. Yes, getting into stuff. Aristotle believed that humans have a purpose, which is the fulfillment of human nature, the aim of the good life. As mentioned last time, Aristotle, like Plato, like many thinkers of the ancient world, is teleological. And teleological, I have heard that word actually used in a more modern sense, as in human purposes are teleological. But in a certain sense, I don't know if we could think of anything without intentionality, purpose. In fact, I would offer emotions. Would we think of anything? So in a certain sense, the world is teleological for Aristotle, not because we have purposes, but because the world has purposes and ends in things. And when things fulfill their ends, they behave more in accord with nature and are healthy and happy. Aristotle very much believes this and believes the universe has intentions, and when you follow the intents, then you have the purposes, and the methods and the means. For all intents and purposes. Yes, intensive purposes, as many say. I have said that many a time. It is intents and purposes, but all of these are rather intensive purposes in that they are cosmic. So while many goals in life merely lead to further additional goals, such as the goal of making money leading to the goal of pleasure or security, Aristotle argues that there must be a final goal, an end in itself. That sounds similar to Socrates, who inspired Plato, who taught Aristotle. What is this final goal, which should be universal and common to all of humanity? Sappho wrote that each person has something, often different things, that make them happy. For Aristotle, this sort of subjective relativism is not good enough. And again, Socrates does sound relativistic in the early Platonic dialogues, but he also says, but there's one thing for all, one for all, and all for one. So what is this final goal that's universal to all, as Socrates said? So for Aristotle, if we are to understand human nature in the form of the good life, we must find something which is pursued for its own sake and universally valued. This is similar to Socrates and Plato's Meno. He argues the good must be the same for all, and it is reason, the work of philosophy and science, which is the realization of the human, the fulfillment of human nature. Yeah, buddy. Well, we're going to fulfill human cat nature later, again, when I give them treats. So, like his teacher Plato, Aristotle argues that each of the three parts of the soul can be virtuous in their own way. Again, you cannot get much of Plato and Aristotle without understanding Plato's Timaeus. Please see that talk on that. I even skim over a lot of that. If you want to get into detail about the world Plato and Aristotle believe at least they inhabit, you need to read the Timaeus in detail and understand they believe in that sort of Pythagoreanism, something fierce. Or at least that seems the evidence as best we have. So Aristotle argues, a la the Timaeus, which he is completely in line with in On the Soul, his most important work, like the Timaeus of Plato in the medieval ages of Christians, Muslims, etc., plenty of folks. He argues the three parts of the soul can be virtuous in their own way. Now, the lowest center of desire, again, centered in the stomach, if it seems like a weird reading of the Republic to say it's stomach, heart, head, that's what Aristotle says here, that you have situated in the stomach is virtuous when it promotes bodily health, what Aristotle calls nutritional virtue. Virtue. Them's good eating. The second center of spirit is situated in the chest, is virtuous when it promotes discipline and justice, what Aristotle calls moral virtue. Think that your heart pumps when you get emotional, and you yell at people a bunch, all righteously, of course, never otherwise. Finally, the highest center of reason, situated in the head, along with the eyes, is virtuous when it promotes study, investigation, and contemplation, what Aristotle calls intellectual virtue. Fun fact, actually, it's not too clear whether or not Aristotle and Plato and other people thought the head was the center top, or if it's sort of also, as I'm saying all this totem pole stuff, they clearly thought that the higher senses on the body were higher up, but at the same time they may have also believed higher senses are good, but it may have been also somewhat, for Aristotle anyway, perhaps not Plato, but for Aristotle, the heart, somewhat like Chinese philosophy people have mentioned. For Aristotle, decently, the heart is the center of the human being, but how much is that the head? This also has to do with whether or not ancient people understood much about the brain. And again, look into that with others, and the evidence is there and not, and other things, and they could even contradict themselves, and we should not hold them strictly to these or that words alone rather than everything they say. But it seems the head is above, but keep in mind it's actually questionable whether or not they're talking about the brain, which Aristotle possibly thought was a blood cooling mechanism, even though the eyes are the highest senses that do deal with fire and light. And I have said, memory is for the Greeks like bouncing around light and fire in your head, but that doesn't mean that actually the head, as opposed to the heart, is the center. That does get confusing, and again, maybe they think that was weird, esoteric, complex knowledge, and it's far simpler than our present understandings of anatomy. But that is where it does actually fit up with the Chinese stuff somewhat and doesn't, and all of this is ancient physics, cosmology, for physicians who studied physics, and the physicians, studied with their fellow physicians the body. So Aristotle believes that intellectual virtue leads to moral virtue, and that moral virtue leads to nutritional virtue. Again, if you have your head stacked up, you have your heart stacked up, and if you have your heart stacked up, you have your stomach stacked up. Again, even though I just confused all of that, and it is confusing, it does seem like they're decently in line with the totem pole theory here. They want a stack in the middle, and Aristotle also believes in balance. Plato likes dialectic. Aristotle is very into balance here with ethics. So you get your ducks in a row when there's balance, balance, balance. Specifically, this balance keeps this in balance, keeps this in balance. And hey, what do you know? That's shaped like the Republic in the city and Timaeus' Pythagorean cosmos. So, when we are unhealthy, it is because we are undisciplined. And when we are undisciplined, it is because we are unwise. A healthy person may not be wise or disciplined, have good thought, good emotion in a row, good heart. Like a talented artist who is neither courageous nor wise, so somebody who's all hungry for, to do something, but then is not very courageous or not very smart. A healthy person may not be wise or disciplined, like in which case they will likely not remain healthy or talented for long. Similarly, a spirited or a disciplined person, a warrior kind of Spartan kind of person. I was having a student who was awesome say they want to stick up for the Spartans a bit more for the intellectual in the Spartans. That's cool. Definitely Plato, as mentioned, did not, he had his view of the Spartans, certainly. Not the worst one, actually, because he does say we should train our warriors up like the Spartans, which is an iffy thing to say in Athens, along with let's have Egyptianish priests, who are rather a bit, it's been heard, a bit monotheistic-like. That would be challenging ye old gods, and that's the kind of thing that got Socrates killed. Even though he may not, that be Plato, that would maybe Plato in later years, suggesting to a divided audience that actually Socrates was into Egypt, whether or not he was entirely. So Plato was, and so was Pythagoras with the triangles, and the Tetractys a la pyramids. So if a warrior is all disciplined, but if they're not wise and they're not listening to somebody wiser like the philosopher kings, they may fall off. But if you are a strong warrior, you probably would have your stomach somewhat disciplined, because if you're all honorable, then you would be worried about being too skinny or too fat or too unbalanced physically or something like that. Not to resort to weight. But that is something that Aristotle is thinking of. If you're too skinny, if you're too fat, you need to be in balance, and that would have to be stomach virtue, nutritional virtue, which if you were honorable enough and enough, like I'm going to be a warrior and talk pretty one day at you, then yes, with the mouth and the breath and the spirit and be all spirited, then I should hopefully have my nutrition in balance and in a row. It's been hard during the pandemic. I've been eating frozen pizza, a bit out of balance, even though it is rather circular. You could invisible basketballs, spin it. So, like the cosmos, yes. It's quite the combination, Again, make me one with everything, as the Buddhist joke goes in the pizza place. So, at first, human individuals are neither wise nor disciplined, neither. They must be taught wisdom and discipline by others who are already rational and moral, and then through practice develop what they receive from others to become rational and moral themselves. This is very similar to Sun Tzu, the third in line of Confucianism after Confucius and Mencius in the tradition of Confucianism, who does believe we're wicked wolf girl people. We just don't have any sort of moral fiber itself. We are set up to get it, but actually we get it from others outside of us. And how did the first then kings and sages do it? They looked to the cosmos, because the cosmos is intelligent, so you'd have intelligence above you, is what Sun Tzu says. That seems Aristotle very much. He also seems pessimistic a bit about human beings being virtuous without being instructed. As is Plato, very much. Both not so stomach pro-democracy, as we'll get here in this talk. So in acquiring intellectual, moral, and nutritional virtue, we find that a balance between extremes is best, what Aristotle calls the doctrine of the mean. That's also suspiciously a Confucian sounding. He did not get this from Confucians, but it is very similar to the mean and the doctrine of the mean text of the Confucians, which I have a short entry on. Not a video one, but an entry on my website. And it is remarkably similar to Aristotle's Politics and Ethics altogether. Mean here is the middle, not the mean as in rude or aggressive in behavior. In all things, which means being mean isn't being in balance and with the mean, because we use the word mean to mean something like not average, but close to in math. Please talk to a mathematician about what the difference between mean and average is. We're not going to cover that here. But in all things, we chart a middle course between excess and deficiency, too much or too little, the two opposite extremes. Aristotle uses the example of gymnastic exercises, which make an individual strong when there is neither too little nor too much, neither. Similarly, we should not eat too much or too little if we want to be healthy, as well as not study too much or too little if we want to be wise. Wisdom tells us when we are being too brave or too cowardly, fearing too much or too little, because the mind puts the heart in check. Aristotle argues that there are many virtues. Perhaps, as I was talking, actually, it's the eyes that put something like the breath in check, and then all of that is balanced in the heart, perhaps? Again, it gets weird and iffy. Aristotle argues there are many virtues, each a mean, a balance between a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. Courage is the balance between haste and cowardice. If you are too hasty, you are kind of cowardly because you're too quick with it. If you're too averse, if you're too lazy or averse to action, you are not courageous, because courageous means not being too hasty, being patient, but also not averse and not taking too long. Temperance is the mean between being too sensitive and too insensitive. Nobility is the mean between vanity and lack of self-worth. Sincerity is the mean between boastfulness and self-deprecation. Wittiness is the mean between being too silly, as I like to be, and you can check out behind me, or too somber. I am not that, so I cannot be witty, again, and am unbalanced. Modesty is the mean between being too bashful and too shameless. I, again, am a bit shameless here. Just like Aristotle's categories, some of these are interrelated, confusingly, not categorically distinct, and Aristotle is only somewhat successful at distinguishing them from each other. Like Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, Aristotle is arguing virtue is a balancing act between extremes. I misphrased. Of course, Aristotle is like Aristotle, and he is like Buddha and Confucius. Like virtue, Aristotle believed that justice is itself a balancing act, agreeing with Plato's form of the soul found in the Republic, which holds that justice is the lower put in check by the higher. Aristotle emphasizes that this is achieved by moderation. Justice has two sides: distribution of rewards to those who do good, which Aristotle calls distributive justice. Again, keep in mind, these words sound very fancy. In fact, a lot of times people are like, wow, Aristotle is so precise and so scientific. These are modern English transliterations of simpler Greek syllabled words, finely marbled and syllabled. Distributive justice. You can actually see when people translate Aristotle, you look at the original. I am not the language guy, but I own a book somewhere around here You can buy Aristotle in the Greek and then on the other side the English, and they're wrestling with it, and they're showing you how they're wrestling with it to show you what translators are doing. And when you look into books like that, which are actually useful to have if you do not have any, you do not know Greek, but you like Aristotle, you can actually see that Aristotle says simple Greek words, and then they have to say distributive, which is actually several syllables, because they are trying to figure out the best English equivalent of that. Not to shame or slam Aristotle at all. It is the thing where when you put Indian philosophy in complex terms, it's like, my God, these guys are smart, maybe smarter than the Greeks. It's like, keep in mind, of course, these are the fancy terms we are giving for possibly simpler words each time that then we can put into very precise academic terms. That certainly makes Aristotle sound like a modern academic. It also does successfully me, even though neither of us are, yes? Not in the slightest. So you have distribution and correction, basically, is the carrot and the stick in the British folk tradition. It is used to direct society, planned out rationally by the philosophers and implemented courageously by the police. So you have distributive justice, punishment for those who do wrong, and corrective justice, as Aristotle says. Distributing the carrot, correcting with the stick. As the Zen folks call it, ye old stick of compassion. They don't call it ye old, but the stick of compassion is what the master uses on you if you are meditating and dozing off. Or the master just can sort of see that you're just about at enlightenment and they may need a smack or two. One at a time, though. It's hard to smack people twice with the stick at the same time. Conflicts of desire, like social conflicts in the city, result in imbalance, excess, and lack. Socrates argues in Plato's Republic that no one would knowingly do evil, as they would see that it is not in their best interest, so a conflict in desires can lead to ignorance and a lack of courage or wisdom. For Aristotle, it is possible for a person to knowingly do evil when they are conflicted, as they can see what is the wisest or courageous choice, but they are too overwhelmed by an excess of desire or honor to do what they know to be right. Certainly now, with politics being what it is, you can actually ask yourself, of course, from either side, when people do massive stuff that you don't like, do they, and even if they do have inklings that, okay, well, I could have done something else, but I'm going to do this, how often are they doing what is wrong and they truly think they are doing what is wrong? That is a very interesting question. We're not going to pursue it here, but I will simply say that I have, especially lately, been talking with people and mentioned, well, Socrates technically, and it is tempting, I have to say, in many reasons. I am interested in human hypocrisy and perspective and all of that very, very much, aren't we all? Or at least invested in it, even if we're not interested in more of it. Given human hypocrisy, how much do we understand what we do? Socrates says, well, you can have an inkling that you're doing the wrong thing or something else, but you actually genuinely believe, nope, I'm doing the right thing here, even though it's stupid. That's tempting, So, because it sort of is kind of like, but if you really, really, really feel it's the good thing, that will override. Perhaps, perhaps not. Again here, how much do we lie to ourselves and tell ourselves we're doing the good thing? I think that may be a decent part of it. So, Socrates, like the Neo-Confucian philosopher Ming, would say that if a person does not know what is right, then they may say they know what is courageous or wise, but in fact they do not know. It cannot be said to see what is good if they act wrong and are merely telling others what they expect they want to hear. There's a lot that's tempting to that in a lot of cases. Of course, it is possible for people to suck it up, do something knowing it's massively wrong, but are they doing that because in the calculus they feel it will be right? Miguel León Portilla argues in his Aztec Thought and Culture, which is a great book. I am going to do more videos next semester, work it into the European stuff when we get to the Americas, because modern European philosophy actually includes a bunch of Americans, oddly enough, like myself. We can fit in a little bit of Aztec and Mayan thought, and I've been meaning to squeeze that into the lectures. So into the videos and the website content, actually. So, León Portilla, which, I misspelled his name, actually, in these lecture notes. It has an R in it. Portilla, not Pontilla, argues that in Aztec Thought and Culture, that the Aztecs and Mayans had theoretical philosophy like the Greeks you can find in their poetry, and what was not all burned and destroyed by the Spanish and the conquistadores, and the central ethical concept, similar to Confucius in China and Aristotle in Greece, is, you are my other self. I'm a big fan of sort of psychological skepticism. Why would philosophy be similar the whole planet over? Because human beings have similar forms of life, and they hear liars. All cultures have liars. All cultures have truth tellers. So people say, what is the truth and what is the lie? Which they would need to hear. How could you have any pursuit of truth unless you have had active lies and deception again and again, or at least been mistaken? But probably there's liars as well if you live with at least 2 or 3 people. Yeah? I guess you wouldn't see it if you're alone. A la Socrates, but if you are my other self, that is very similar to Confucius, and that is very similar to Aristotle, as well as the world over of talk. Aristotle argues that to be ethical is not only to love oneself in moderation, but to love others and the cosmos in moderation, sharing your life in common. Like the nous of Plato's Timaeus, the mind which guides all things, a la Anaxagoras, leading us and others like a cow. Fine, short-horned cows, yes, domestically bred, out of longhorns. Unlike this mind, which simply contemplates itself, the unmoved mover in itself, as some sublime ethereal substance, perhaps super ethereal, like friendship between individuals and scientific comprehension of the cosmos, it is sought not because it is pleasurable, but because it is the end in itself. It's where the energy flows, upward to the mind. And that's why it's satisfying. Not because it's satisfying, but because it is in accord with nature. There are many thinkers who would say, Wittgenstein says, I don't know why we're here, but I'm pretty sure it's not to be happy. Aristotle would agree with that very much. There's many ways where later Wittgenstein and Aristotle would oddly agree, even though they very much disagree about logic quite a lot, much, not entirely though, is that what we do in life is we fulfill our purpose. Sometimes that makes us happy. But a lot of times it does not, but we still do what we're supposed to do, whether or not it makes us happy. So happiness is part of doing what we're supposed to do. It helps us do what we're supposed to do. But the ultimate aim of things is not to be happy. You just stack your ducks in a row and then you have decently the good life, and that makes you happy enough. But the point is not that it's driving you into that with happiness, as somebody, a more Humean or utilitarian or possibly a later Brit might say. Whether or not the Brits have ever been happy, you know what I mean? But that you have here that it's not happiness, which is why we do anything, here or in Britain. It is because we do what is in accord with how we are in tune with things, and then sometimes, often, if we are doing what is right, that brings also happiness. So Epicurus, who we are going to have soon, says happiness is the highest goal. Those who say, and he is a forerunner of the Brits and Mill and utilitarianism. Some hate it. I like it all right. It has its problems. But Epicurus would say, no, and he's more like kind of he's not a cynic like Diogenes, but he's much more the cynic like Nietzsche. If somebody tells you there's something beyond happiness that you're going for, unfortunately for this subtle, all too simple creature we are, no, we move towards happiness, and that means happiness is good, and you cannot be truly happy without living wisely for Epicurus. So Epicurus would say, no, happiness and wise is very much the same thing. It's just the people who are happy on a heroin binge for the next 15 minutes are not going to be truly happy. This, of course, shows us ethics here, where you have, well, is it what makes you truly feel good? Epicurus would say, very much kind of like Socrates, if an individual isn't doing something, they may be wrong, they may be temporarily setting themselves up with bad happiness or bad faith, a la Sartre or something, but they're not doing what will truly make them happy. Whereas for Aristotle, it's not about happiness, it's truly in accord with your nature, and then also there is sometimes happiness. That's the kind of thing that actually further brain studies will tell us more, but of course, unless you meet neurons personally in life, I would look for that in others and see all that out for yourself. This would make a good paper, of course, for the class. As would a lot of these points. Let's hope. So, by relating to others through friendship, again, and to the cosmos, in investigation and contemplation, we complete ourselves, fulfill our human nature, and achieve our highest purpose. Which is quite happy and beautiful, although that isn't the primary thing, as already mentioned. So given that, ethics is clearly quite political for Aristotle. So let us get into Aristotle's Politics. That ethics is necessary for finding its resolution that ethics necessarily has to find resolution in communion with others and politics. And Aristotle is very famously quoted as writing, "Man is by nature a political animal." I am, by the way, linking Aristotle constantly to Alice in Wonderland right now. I am going to be working on more videos about that, which I plan to present to the Carroll Society of North America in April. I do believe the white rabbit is an absurdly rational animal. In fact, it's supposed to be an irrational animal as a rabbit, but it's I'm late, oh no, and it's kind of terribly rational and is out of balance and is all out of whack. I do think that Lewis Carroll is using the white rabbit somewhat as an absurd rational animal presented to a child who is supposed to grow up into an adult who doesn't like adulthood so much. It's kind of like a mock Aristotelian image of the rational animal here, and man is not only a rational animal, and mostly man here, not woman or little girl. Man is by nature also a political animal. Aristotle is on record famously for saying both. We are the rational animal, and thus we are the political animal. So supposedly here bees are not political at all for Aristotle, which, although would by degrees be participating in the same things and organs as humans. Very minutely, I suppose. Tiny little buzz. Aristotle thinks that mind and speech are by nature social, which is, I will back up completely. There's a lot for that. Would we be raised in a closet? Kant says later, you could be raised privately in a closet without anything else, and you could come to reason all on your own and come to math. Again, many would say that nowadays, and I would say with Wittgenstein, that is quite impossible. Not perfectly impossible given VR, but VR isn't a dark closet either. You have Althusser's living son of waking in the 1100s in the Islamic world. Would a child on a desert island by themselves come up with adamantic speech and would be perfectly behaved? Well, you can debate that with Tom Hanks and the volleyball, I suppose, if it talks back. So for Aristotle, much like the Confucians of China, a unified family is the basic component of a unified village. This is the doctrine of the mean of the Confucians, which is itself the basic component of a unified state. In the same way that the individual must acquire courage and wisdom from others to put desires in check, so too must families gather into villages and villages into states. This is the process of representation for the Vikings, the Chinese, and everybody. The head of the village goes and talks to the head of the council, who then goes to the uppers. People have had something like that, plenty, and need to, everywhere. So that families gather into villages into states, such that the cops and the philosophers can arise and perform their function. Here, Aristotle seems to follow very much the form of the Republic, although he doesn't think the Republic is entirely balanced as Plato speaks of it. Just as the purpose of individual life is reason, the purpose of society for Aristotle is the cultivation of courage in warriors and wisdom in philosophers. Following very much Plato's plan set out in the Republic, Aristotle believes the purpose of the city is ultimately philosophy, as it is only this that can preserve and order the whole. Unfortunately, Aristotle argues that some people are best suited for slavery, distinct from those who have merely been taken as slaves through war, who are higher slaves. Perhaps they can do your accounting for you in your house, and have the afternoon off to listen to Aristotle or Epicurus. Aristotle was openly ethnocentric, believing the Greeks to be a balanced people. Again, he is a Macedonian barbarian, saying, we're such a balanced people. He's somewhat preaching what would be advantageous for him to say in town, and then once Alexander died, he was afraid they might not find him so Athenian. And all that would be a bit of imbalance between him and others, yes? A little hostilely, all that. So believing the Greeks to be a balanced people possessing both minds like the Asian Persians and bodies like the European tribes, which he does seem to suggest, not just Persians and not just Europeans, but as a Germanic person myself, Aristotle does not think the Europeans and the Germanics are civilized or rational at all. They are very much beasts of burden, but the Persians and Egyptians and other folks, somewhat Persians and Babylonians to the east, sort of the Eastern peoples to the Greeks, they're all civilized, but they think they're sort of nerdy, skinny people who cannot throw spears and row boats real well, which, of course, as always mentioned, the Greeks make a point to tell you we're smart, but we're all so strong, dang it. And they do it all the time. And here's Aristotle, fitting very much, which does not look like the origins of pure science. It looks like they're like, nope, we're a balanced people, unlike the too sciencey, brainy people. It is similar to the speech of Pericles, already mentioned many times. We have learned book learning, but we have not compromised our manliness. Just as it is natural and right for men to rule women, for Aristotle, and he says this blatantly, for husband to rule wife accordingly, so too it is natural for the Greeks to make slaves of those peoples incapable of reason and philosophy. He uses these as his comparisons. Ironically, Aristotle himself, again, had to be chased out, fled, not chased out. He fled before he was chased, as he would be considered a barbarian, a foreign babbler. Continuing To speak of property, Aristotle differs from Plato and his conception of an ideal city. Again, Plato is quite the communist. He really does suggest we don't really talk about the slaves or so much the women folk, but everybody else is going to have family raised in common on picnic benches, all eating breakfast together. We're not going to know exactly who our own children are, he suggests. He says that we're going to mix up all private property, so at least the cops and the philosophers do not have their own blankets or buckets. That is going to muck up the works and not make them as general and unbiased as possible. Which again, it's sort of like Jains of India having no personal property, being naked, and then they have communal brooms they use to sweep the ground for insects so they don't kill them, but you don't have your own broom. It's sort of it's like the Jesuits with Hondas. The Jesuits don't own their own Hondas. Technically the order does, so they all have, they have cars. But none of them are theirs, probably helps with the taxes. Not sure about death, though, for the Honda. So Aristotle, in accord with the doctrine of the mean, basically thinks there should be a balance of public and private property, unlike the Jesuits, or the Jains here. He argues that Plato was overly confident in people's ability to be similar. I always think of The Onion, the humor newspaper. It's like fine woolen blanket ruins hippie commune, And again, it's a short article. You don't really have to read it. You kind of get it. Again, much love. I am a little hippie-ish, not too hippie-ish. Much love to the hippies, but yes, we get it. You try to be purely communist, and what happens? Somebody gets all private with stuff. It's my turn with the blanket. No, it isn't. Look at the sheet. Look at the communal clipboard. Oh, it went missing. You know what I mean? And yes, lovely happiness all the way down, And again, how many times can we go down the same roads, turn our heads continuously around like an owl? Yes, but not of Minerva, as Bob Dylan learns how to sing for the very first time. He will someday. So Aristotle correctly says first there was bartering. He actually suggests before money there was bartering, and he sees this, of course, in his world. People barter and then have money also, but then they weighed amounts of metal which were later stamped with insignias because barter was impossible over long distances. That's true. Also mentioned it's hard to steal a briefcase full of salmon and keep it around for a week, but you can steal $1 million in a briefcase, which changes everything plenty. Not only eventually, but it's, again, in ancient China, the Taoist says, grabs the gold, didn't see any of the people in the marketplace. What are you, an idiot? Wealth should be measured not by its amount, but how it is used. It is not virtuous to seek money for its own sake, Aristotle says, but money itself is not evil. So he's not the Old Testament here. Usury, lending money with interest expected, is, he says, an unnatural and disgusting use of wealth. You do find, of course, not only is this famously bound up with the history of Judaism in Europe and Islam, and also in history of anti-Semitism, you do find that in the Old Testament it prohibits specifically usury. We live in a very capitalist country. Technically, the Old Testament prohibits borrowing with interest. But we just do it now and don't care, much like we do not cover our heads, even though Paul says you're supposed to, because it's Germanic to not, and Western Europeans don't, Germanic savages, like myself, a bit hippie-ish, so that part of the Bible's just ignored. And similarly, usury, lending money with interest, we do that with computers lending fractions of cents now, and borrowing and lending with algorithms and computers. Technically, the reason that Jews were blamed for, with a lot of anti-Semitic sorts of stuff, still also is because the Old Testament prohibits borrowing and lending to your own people, but technically people decided to read the Bible. You can have Jews borrow and lend to Muslims and Christians, and that's not illegal, and then you blame the Jews whenever they're the evil people for all of this. So technically, I do believe in the Middle Ages, Jews would not lend with interest to their own, but would to Christians and Muslims, and then Christians and Muslims specifically had them do that, not because they didn't want it, but because they would not do it for their own people. It's actually also like Jews in vaudeville, just to mention something. In vaudeville, of course, which is known for having Jewish individuals in vaudeville and then Hollywood, that is because a lot of white Protestants and others did not want to work with white Catholics, black people, jazz musicians, other Jews, Italians, Greeks, people who are other unclean ethnicities. And the Jews are like, we were, so they worked with various ethnicities of people, which is why there's Jews in jazz music and other things like that. And Hollywood. And of course, unfortunately, there's anti-Semitism about that. Well, they're trying to get their foot in the door, in a way. Well, they got in where they fit in, as the bard said here from Oaktown. And yeah, all of that, and the magic and the mystery, you know? So usury is a good word, and yeah, technically the Bible says don't do it. We do it to our own kind now plenty with the credit card. If you have anything on a credit card, you're involved in it. And we don't care whether or not it is Jews not lending to Christians, such that we could be even more anti-Semitic, which of course is still here alive and well and in Paris. About governments, Aristotle says there are 3 forms. This is a wonderful place where you can actually find out he is not so much the Democrat or into democracy. Monarchy, he tutored Aristotle, the Sun King of old. That's set a little quickly. Aristocracy, aristocracy, and republic. A corrupt monarchy is a tyranny, a corrupt aristocracy is an oligarchy, and a corrupt republic is a democracy, is what Aristotle says. Now that tells you he is rather Republican dad. Why? Because he does believe, just like you send the village elder to the council, and that's not necessarily elected, but his top guy, and that's as democratic as it gets. It doesn't have to involve voting here entirely. A republic would more be sending top guy who's over everybody. Republicans, again, actually are more believe in electing our betters. And Democrats today, it has switched around in ways. But Democrats are sort of, now we've had populist movements, and there's been a lot of interesting back and forth. All this does overlap. You will find Republicans sort of are conservative and say, well, we want to, nowadays, elect someone who's the better above what have you. You have Democrats doing the same, but saying, well, this is of kind of more the people, get more accused of socialism and all of that. You have here, actually, this fits somewhat with what Aristotle says, and he's like, no, you put the rational over the irrational. There's a lot of terrible people, and they're supposed to be firmly in their place. That's not as many Americans talk, though. We have a lot more mobility and are proud that the Walmart family can come up as a bunch of farmers and own, the Waltons, and then own Walmarts, So, and they're some of the richest people in the world nowadays. They were firmly middle class and farmers back in the day. Not low, but middle. So, a lot of that, In fact, the Medicis, who funded the School of Raphael, the School of Athens and all that. And you can see Aristotle in a lot of those images, and I show that to you. They were middle-class merchants, and then they worked their way up. They could buy their way into nobility at some point. So this kind of mobility, again, is a thing all throughout, plenty. It creates a diamond-like shape. You definitely have, so here, there is something like, not just a pyramid, but it creates a diamond-like shape for Aristotle, because Aristotle argues the best form of government is monarchy. He says this. That would be very European for a long time. If you are like, wow, the West has been into democracy. No, it hasn't. And they weren't into democracy plenty while they were into Aristotle, as were Muslims. So if it's like, wow, reading Plato and Aristotle makes our society democratic, here again, sort of, in the complexity of things. It's related to the Greeks, sort of, but it also is not only traditional various human living patterns in a new complex, but Aristotle very much says you need a good king, which is like most Brits and most folks all throughout. I was just watching a video on L. Ron Hubbard, and apparently L. Ron Hubbard had a kind of vision, and he wanted in the name of Excalibur originally. Which, if you like Excalibur, and not to say anything else about L. Ron Hubbard, and I haven't read that piece at all, but he had sort of a prophecy about Excalibur, and that would revolutionize everything. And Excalibur, again, would be something like a noble king on top. It creates, again, a diamond, because in a certain sense, there's a republic followed by there is a monarchy followed by an aristocracy, and then a republic followed by a democracy, oligarchy, and last tyranny. So, in other words, for Aristotle, as he argues, if one guy is good, that's the best. If one guy is worse, that's the worst. So he says it's kind of a balancing act, and that sort of makes sense. He does not say a diamond, but if we look at it kind of like a diamond, say, something like this, where we have good over here, bad over there, middle, it would be good to balance somewhat with a bit of group rule, a bit of guys on a council. Machiavelli worked for 9 rich guys, which was democracy, and then he had to work for the Medicis under house arrest for a while, which was tyranny. Not so good for him. By his cautious words that he only passed around after he was dead, that you have democracy kind of republic is in the middle. It's balance, but it's not good balance because, as Aristotle says, it'd be better to have a good king. If you can find a good noble king, like Excalibur, you pull the sword out of the lake is what I'm thinking. That one guy should be your king, Jesus, God, elder, figure thing. And then, but if we can't find that, we should temporarily have a good fewer or manier, not manyest, because again, that would be too stomachy and out of balance. You can see where he is trying to balance out the republic, fearing a possible evil tyrant and republic. Plato would just say, well, that guy will fall off, you know what I mean? And so, of course, we're going to stack it up into the fewer philosopher kings above. Because good kings are rare, again seeking a balance in the middle, Aristotle argues a republic is safest, but he clearly does not want a democracy for voting for everyone. As Aristotle is ethnocentric and not very egalitarian, he says that different peoples are suited for different forms of government. The Greeks have both spirit of the Europeans, or beast-like people. Yay. It's again manly men. Naturally, but not entirely men. Naturally suited for slavery. In the minds of Asians, more to the east, they are suited for... the Greeks, he argues here, are best for ruling themselves in a republic, but he doesn't want a republic because he oddly wants to be a bit more kingly like the East. Now, again, Macedon and some folks were more into Persia and Egypt. Alexander, after being tutored by Aristotle, claims to be the Sun King of Egypt and identifies himself with Persian Zoroastrian and the sun and the monotheism. So that definitely that seems like not Aristotle, but Alexander is taking a page from his tutor, yes, or 2 or 3 scrolls, along with his trip. Aristotle argues that money should be excluded from politics, a fine idea, except that this also means, as already mentioned, that if you're not wealthy enough, and he's just thinking, well, of course literate people are decently well-off people. That's what he assumes. I mean, if he's talking to you, and if you can argue, he would assume you're not some German savage. He would assume that you have at least some education and some diction, and you've had a tutor who've taught you a bit of rhetoric. You're of a more upper-class person for Aristotle, as well as for Confucius or other people. Because, yeah, you would be, or for India, for Buddha, it could be common people, and common people are common people, but it would be somewhat assumed that you would be talking to a more educated person if you're talking to somebody who could rule or say things well. That Aristotle does believe if you do not have somebody ready to hand you lemonades, you're not ready to be a total philosopher because you should be made in the shade and not have to cook your own food or do stuff. And remember, Socrates, after he is condemned by the assembly, which is a more evil democratic than proper republic for Aristotle, it would seem. And as for Plato, that Aristotle says, give me free food for life. I think that's what you owe me as punishment, which would more be punishment for them than for him, and then more voted for Socrates' death, which clearly here is not a sign of intelligence in the masses for Aristotle. So, people who do not have sufficient money such that they are not worried about, acquiring more of anything, do not have the leisure to do philosophy or science. Again, if you're doing philosophy or science, though, today, you can't worry about money. How could you? You know what I mean? You just can't. That this is best for politics, and common people, such as craftsmen and farmers, must be excluded, or they will put their interests in money above justice. This is oddly similar to what some on the right say today, saying, again, somewhat sort of prosperity gospel, a little bit. And also, I have to say, again, I don't try to take this all left-wing or anything, there is decently, as with everybody, there is on both sides and all sides, if somebody's successful, they must know something. That is very human. And there certainly is, let's just say, hey, you know what, let's not say right or left, let's say both sides, certainly. There is definitely the, well, you made a bunch of money, clearly you must be an amazing person. Like, if you made a bunch of money, you must be awesome. Or if you were born wealthy, clearly somebody in your family did something right, maybe you're of good stock, you know. Of course, when it's an evil wealthy person, they must have gotten ill-gotten gains, malas, yes. And I'm not going to sing the Ghana song, all norteño for you right now, although I would like to. I have to brush up on my Spanish. So we have here, against all of this, as well as for Aristotle, that money is, of course, involved in the corrupting of politics. Aristotle himself has already talked about usury and money being an improper end in itself. But Aristotle does not consider it wise to allow working people to become citizens, vote, or serve on juries. Which actually, again, definitely seems decently authoritarian and traditional. of the time. Aristotle did believe that children should be educated publicly by the state from age 7 to 21. Now that's Pythagoras. If I did not mention properly with Pythagoras, Pythagoras does say 7 years, 14 years, 21 years is childhood, adolescent, teen, young adult, and then when you hit 21, which is actually when you're out of college, it is you hit high school at 13-ish, not 14, but you have childhood and Piaget. And child development does say something like that is somewhat true, but actually there's more stages, but there is major stage around 7 and around 11, and then, which is a little earlier, shy of 14, and then you have a full-on adult is around the age of 21. Notice actually that's when you can get alcohol, although you can vote and go into the military, and get SIGs somewhat earlier, I think, in most states. So yeah, there's all of that, oddly enough. I don't think we're all being strictly Pythagorean, though. That may be somewhat accidental. But again, you have 7, 7, 7. That would be a triangle of sevens. And then you have maturity for 3 times 7, 21. For Pythagoras. Children should be educated, believing in public education, that you need a balance of public and private. Aristotle does think children should be educated as soon as you figure out a kid can't be more educated and is dim, though. Of course, they're somewhat kicked to the curb and become a worker. But, a la the Republic, Aristotle does think we should at least have public education enough. This is also Confucian's civil service bureaucracy, that you figure out, you get the best and the brightest, you keep them going up the chain, and then you figure out where they best fit in the pyramid downward. He does believe that. That is not crazy, so crazy to anybody, no matter how egalitarian or conspiratorial we are. So, children should be educated in art, gymnastics, and literacy, corresponding to desire, spirit, and reason of the Timaeus and the Republic. Studying too much art or gymnastics without enough attention to literacy, reading, and writing would create unbalanced results. Judging by his recommendation that working people should not become citizens or vote, it doesn't seem Aristotle would advocate for public education of all children all the way through to 21, though. Would make sense. Again, craftsmen and farmers take up their vocation long before they are actually 21, which would be college, post-college, and all of that. And that is a bit, unfortunately, Aristotelian. Again, and if you go full Marxist, I don't. As Marx says, what is college? It's for feeding the poor to the rich, kids. Basically, if you're unfortunately, while I am not the hard Marxist at all, many Americans have said, well, if you are you middle or upper class? Have you or yours gone to college? That's the main idea. It's not always true. You could be an amazing sports star, you know what I mean? Or there's lots of other things, although sports stars do go to college, and the collegiates often, but could even skip. Technically, again, if you are going to college, that makes you middle or upper class in our society, which means for Marx and for other cynics, I'm decently cynical enough, you are helping to feed the poor to the rich, and that's what both the left and the right decently think nowadays anyway, if you're paying any attention to politics other than Aristotle's, yes? All right, happiness. Again, no vitriolic politics all aside. That was Aristotle's social thought, ethics, and politics. This is the new camera, actually. Got a bit more width here. I'm going to actually fix the ceiling because the cats have been attacking it. So let me know what you think of the sound and the visuals. If there's anything wrong or right, please let me know because, again, during the pandemic, I'm not talking to many people. I am going to do a talk on Aristotle's Logic. However, I did say I'm going to do a talk on Aristotle's Logic next. I think what I am actually going to do, because I've been looking through the Logic lecture, the Logic on Aristotle still has a bunch on syllogisms and Wonderland in it that I want to rework. Because I do feel confident that the royalty of Wonderland and the Looking Glass are symbolizing the 4 corners of the square of opposition. I do. Or the 4 forms of proposition, which then form as the basis of the 4 syllogisms, the 4 of the 1 perfect form of the syllogism, which is odd language, but Aristotle's. But all of that logic work, actually, I'm going to be doing logic next semester. Please, of course, read all the lectures. I do want to rework that work. So what I am probably going to do is this is the second of 2 talks on Aristotle. I am going to save a lecture. Please read the lecture notes on logic. I am probably going to, after this, I will weigh and consider and balance in the middle with Baby Bear Theory and Aristotle. But I am probably going to do a talk on skepticism, a talk on Epicurus, and then a talk on Stoicism in order to finish out the lectures for Greek philosophy before cracking a bit more into Aristotle to give myself some time on his logic, because I have more to do on that, and I technically need to get that talk especially done over the winter break and for next semester. So we will see what I get done. We always do. But yes, there will be a talk next, at least on skepticism, which we are doing after Aristotle. And then we will have a talk on Epicurus and Epicureanism and happiness, already mentioned here, which Aristotle does not endorse as the higher of purposes and virtue. He would call hedonistic, and many do, Epicureanism. And then we will have folks who are not accused of hedonism much ever at all, the Stoics, because if you break Epictetus's leg, he will simply turn to you and, like Spock, say, "Master, that was not logical, Captain," which we will get to as we get through the stuff. So much happiness, everyone. I am also going to be following up. I am saving up for my energy and spirit, my heart and the fire inside of the mind. I am going to be doing a talk on a series of talks on Linji and Joshu and the koan records of Zen, which are quite wonderful, and I want to spend doing a good amount of time. So, much happiness, and I hope you have enjoyed these talks on Aristotle 2. Again, my apologies, but I will save the lecture on logic for when I feel it is better prepared, and I will see you if I ever see you.